Fantastic to hear those jingles again, I must say. Now, on this day of the recording was announced the demise of one of the greatest men of the 20th, 21st or any century. The great revolutionary freedom fighter, leader of the African National Congress, and the man who spent 27 years in the dungeons of apartheid, who emerged to become a totally iconic figure across the whole world. It's said that his image is second only to that of Coca-Cola in recognizability around the globe. He was said today by President Jacob Zuma of South Africa to be a great son of Africa. And there can be absolutely no doubt about that. I have myself a very long history with the African National Congress, and no doubt some of that will emerge in the course of the interview I'm now about to conduct, because we are very lucky to be able to welcome Esther Stanford Xosei, who is an African radio presenter of note, a very bright woman, with a great perspective on African events. So I don't want just to talk about South Africa, Esther, but it would be wrong not to begin with your reflections on the demise over the last few hours of the great leader Nelson Mandela. Welcome to the show, and please,
thank you very much.
Do tell us your reflections, please, on the death of Mandela.
Yes, this passing of Mandela is something that many people have been, if you like, sensitized to might happen over the last few months, and there's been various false starts, and now it's happened. Obviously, it's very tragic, and there's a lot of sadness, and of course we offer condolences to the Mandela family and to all those South Africans who are remembering and honouring the legacy of Mandela. However, my reflections are mixed, because yes, he was a great man. He is still a great man in terms of his moral courage and fortitude and what he went through as a result of being involved with the liberation struggle in South Africa. However, as with any great leader, we don't just look at what they did well, we also look at some of the consequences even of their own actions. And so there are two sides to this story. It's also looking about how best do we honour this man, and it must be to recognise that the freedom struggle in South Africa continues. And so that's really where my thoughts are at today. How do we ensure that we don't just look at South Africa as being a success model, because some of the media reports are looking at this. Well, this was the man who averted a bloodbath. This was the man who prevented civil war in South Africa. But I'm reflecting very much on what have been the costs to Africans in South Africa as a result of the respect and the leadership that was shown at a very difficult time. And also, what were some of the leadership decisions that Nelson Mandela had to make that even today we look back on and say, well, could a different path have been taken? So those are some of my initial, I think, and brief reflections.
Well, I would like to explore those with you. But first I want your reaction, please, to the popping up before the cameras with all sorts of apparently sincere condolences and panegyric tributes to the late Nelson Mandela from some extraordinary folks. Included in those is David Cameron, the British Prime Minister. I'm cursed with the memory of an elephant, and so I remember these moments very well. David Cameron and others still in the House of Commons, the Speaker of the House of Commons, for example, John Bercow, were leading lights in the FCS in the mid-1980s, the Federation of Conservative Students, who ran a campaign which included T-shirts with Mandela's face on them saying, "Hang Nelson Mandela." And I'm sorry to say, though I think he has changed a great deal, that the Speaker of the House, John Bercow, once wore one of those T-shirts, and photographs of that exist, and I have seen them, and I have talked to him about his role in that period. They ran a campaign, Hang Nelson Mandela. Mrs. Thatcher described Nelson Mandela as a terrorist and said that the ANC would never rule South Africa, and that anyone who thought that they would was living in cloud cuckoo land. And I remember very well when Madiba came to Parliament, Mrs. Thatcher was sat in the front row, and I remembered well seeing her lips move in previous years and those words tumbling from her mouth. Now David Cameron is filled with praise for Mandela, and that's because of two things. First of all, on the positive, that Mandela became just too big, too great for anyone to criticize. But secondly, and this relates to the points you've just been making, because Mandela made certain decisions as the leader of the ANC and the putative president and then first president of the liberated country, which set the minds at rest of the powerful and rich in the West and amongst white minority people in South Africa. So first of all, your thoughts when you see these hypocrites?
Well, I think that's the appropriate word to use. It is hypocritical. And we should have a very good memory about this, because otherwise we'll be hoodwinked. And clearly some of us are not being hoodwinked. And it does not surprise me, the statements that are now coming from the Prime Minister of this country. It does shock me, however, that he would think that he could make those statements and that people wouldn't remember his own role. And it just goes to show the lack of morality, I would say, of some of the so-called leaders of this country. And if we were to follow the trajectory of where they were at and how they were thinking in terms of somebody who is now celebrated worldwide as being one of the greatest men on this planet, but yet they could consider this person to be a terrorist and to be somebody who was deserving of hanging, and also a public calling for that. I think that does say something about the people who are leading this government, and it also says something about how we cannot trust them. We really cannot trust them. And if we don't remember what they've done in the past, then I'm afraid that the past might be repeated.
What a wonderful answer, I must say. Now let's turn to the uncomfortable mistakes that Mandela made. And let me, by way of a health warning, if you like, make this point. I was effectively one of the cadre of the ANC. In the 1980s, I entered the country and worked underground in the country. I'm one of the very few people on the left in Britain who travelled the length and breadth of apartheid South Africa. And I did so under the orders of the ANC. And we don't have time to go through all of my experiences in that period. But they included attempting actually to see Mandela in Paulsmoor Hospital, where he was at that time when I was in Cape Town, being chased by the apartheid police, being cornered in Guguletu Township, being beaten and bloodied by a police brute in the police station in Guguletu, being apologized to in the traditional African way by that policeman many years later after the liberation, and accepting his apology under the Truth and Reconciliation process. So I'm in no circumstances an enemy of the ANC, and certainly not of its leader, who's just passed away. But one of the reasons why Western politicians and rich white people in South Africa are able to be so fulsome in their praise of Mandela this morning upon his demise is that he made certain judgment calls which I believe were wrong, and which have led to the situation that South Africa is free of apartheid, but it's not free of the grotesque maldistribution of the country's resources, the majority of African people in South Africa still live lives of very great difficulty, and many of them live lives of absolute misery, immiseration, in shanty towns, in shacks. Once upon a time, places like Guguletu were thought of as hell on earth. Now lucky people live in Guguletu. Lucky people live in Soweto. The unlucky live on the beach, under a cardboard roof, or behind corrugated walls with earthen floors, with no toilets, no water, no public health. And we saw the situation where miners were gunned down by the South African police force. And one of the reasons for that is that these mines remained in private hands, in the hands of the bloodsuckers who always owned them. And Mandela's decisions left those great national resources in the hands of these people. And we saw, I remember my wife and I, who's with me now, watched on television, utterly paralyzed with shock at the sight of South African policemen in liberated South Africa tying a Mozambican man to the back of their vehicle and dragging him to his death, all captured on video. So South Africa didn't change enough. The ANC changed much, but they didn't change enough. And that's because Nelson Mandela was by the time he emerged from Pollsmoor prison, untouchable. He was so supreme, the leader, that frankly he didn't brook much discussion around the leadership table by then. Am I being unfair?
No, you're not being unfair. And unfortunately at this time, it's difficult to speak some of these truths because there is so much emotion, I think, that sort of accompanies how people feel about Mandela on all sides. But that it's important that we break the silence around some of these issues, because otherwise, as I said before, we're going to keep repeating these mistakes, and it's going to end up revisiting all of us, not just those who are living and experiencing impoverishment and victimisation at the hands of the state in South Africa. So in honouring Nelson Mandela, it is important that we stand on his shoulders, but equally that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that were made, not just by him. I mean, yes, we do glorify this man, but we know he was not acting alone. And so all of the mistakes cannot be put at his doors exclusively. It was a whole regime, and I feel for those of us who were not part of that context, we also have to try and understand how difficult it would have been, and also how some of those decisions that came to be made. But as an African person, I also feel this is where we have to speak supreme truth and wisdom to ourselves, and not get caught up in false glorification and this notion that we achieved an apartheid-free South Africa. It was really a changing of the guard. And when the ANC came into power, I think there was a statement that somebody made saying that we may be in government, but that does not mean that we're in power. And so, yes, when you leave the institution of state as it was and you just simply change the guard and put black faces there, then we can understand why now we're having the situation that we've been having, especially with the gunning down of miners, the most oppressed and poorest of the poor in South Africa under an ANC-led government. So, yes, we have to be extremely honest, but with a view to not just critiquing, with a view to looking at where do we go from here. And actually, they say everything happens for a reason, and we can look at this as a great tragic thing, or we can look at the opportunities that now I think become much more available as a result of the passing of Mandela. And there's a conversation that happens on the street and in African community circles where it's said that, if you like, Mandela being there was part of upholding a false notion of peace. because people had so much respect for him, and it was because of his stature, who he was. So even though there was, the most marginalised would always have critiqued and stood up and said, well, hang on a minute, Madiba, hang on, we must look at the legacies of apartheid for us. There was so much pressure, but now that he has transitioned, it will probably allow for many more of those voices, which I believe have been marginalised and silenced, to be heard.
Well, let me tell you some of the things that I know, because I was there, because I was involved. Mandela's majesty, his giganticness, his giantness, was established from a very early time. After the Rivonia trial, and the life sentences that were imposed, the comrades in the ANC were separated, the white behind the wall and the black behind on the other side of that wall. Let me give you an example. And Mandela himself told me this story, and I can supplement it with a word from one of the white prisoners. Mandela took a decision immediately that the sentence began that all the cadre had to stop smoking. This was a bitter blow to many of them because they all smoked. And Mandela told me the story himself. He said, if we are smoking, then we'll be prisoners twice. We'll be prisoners behind the bars and we'll be prisoners of the tobacco. And the jailers will control us by our access to tobacco. So he issued an order that the entire leadership and cadre inside Robben Island had to stop smoking. Now here I crossed the wall. On the other side of the wall was one white prisoner, Dennis Goldberg, who also served 27 years in Robben Island and in Pollsmoor, but never saw Mandela or the others, never once set eyes on them for 27 years. But if nobody had told Dennis that Mandela had given an order that everyone had to stop smoking, he would have smoked for the next 27 years and probably would be dead now. But a jailer told him, when he found him smoking, you obviously haven't heard that Mandela has ordered everybody has to stop smoking. So Dennis, stop smoking, even though Mandela would never have known that he was smoking, unless he saw the wisps of smoke above the wall. That's the majesty and the greatness of Mandela's leadership, the absolutely unquestioning observance of his decisions that were present then in the early 1960s at the beginning of the sentence. And that never changed, except in this regard. By the time of the release, Mandela's worldwide stature had become, well, something almost superhuman. So when he came out, and key decisions had to be made, here's the thinking that was employed. Mandela wanted to avoid white flight. He wanted to avoid liberation leading to the mass exodus of white capital and white professionals and business people and the rest. So he made the concession that they could keep their wealth. They could keep their industries, their businesses. In that sense, therefore, apartheid continued. You couldn't be told to move from District 6 because your hair was too curly. You couldn't be told you couldn't buy a house in that street because you weren't white. But you couldn't buy it anyway because you had no money. And this is, now that you look back on it, although I said it at the time, although only privately, because I didn't want to be disloyal. When you look back on it, this was a disastrous decision. What do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because what it meant is that the wealth was still in the hands of, the white elite, the white settler class as well. And now we would say 10 years of black economic empowerment policy in South Africa. But we're seeing a similar thing in that it's a changing of the guard. And what we are also seeing is an increase in poverty amongst black South Africans. for instance, I think statistics have gone up to by half, so that there is nearly 50% of black South Africans living in poverty. We're seeing an increase in homelessness and landlessness. So there's been the rise of shack dwellers movements who are basically fighting for a reclamation of land. We haven't seen the promises that the ANC made in terms of being able to meet some of the housing deficits and so forth, and deficits in terms of public services and social infrastructure. We've seen them go back on those promises, which actually feed into not only the structural violence, but the extreme rates of physical, direct violence that we see in South Africa. And this was extremely disastrous. We have not seen land reform. And that's hugely problematic, because we talk about the economy and money and wealth and so forth, but we know that a huge part of wealth is linked to land and access to land. And we know that there's a link between those who are landless and those who remain impoverished, and not just in their lifetime, but this is an intergenerational phenomenon. And so ultimately, this notion of freedom that Nelson Mandela and others were part of ushering in, it was a particular type of freedom that, in my view, was a freedom that was constructed by our historical oppressors. It wasn't a freedom that came out of our own thinking. And therefore, not much changed. And we are all feeling the effects of this today.
You and I could talk about South Africa for the rest of the night, but we do have to have a word or two about the rest of the continent. But as a postscript to what you've just said, once I was in the Persian Gulf. I won't identify the country, and I had breakfast with one of the princes there. He told me, a friend of yours is coming for lunch. Do you want to come back for lunch? So I had to eat breakfast and lunch, which is very big in this palace. And when I got there after, he didn't tell me who my friend was. When I got there was a feast for about 150 people of baby camels, a very expensive and very rare delicacy. Quite nice, by the way. And who was my friend? He was one of the key leaders of the struggle in South Africa. I don't want to name him, but he was a comrade of mine. He served in Robben Island with Mandela. He served in Pollsmoor prison with Mandela. And I, as we tucked into the baby camel, asked him, "What are you doing here? Are you on a mission? Are you trying to sell these people something?" He said, No. The prince is my business partner. I said, "What do you mean business partner? And who are all these people?" He said, "These are our senior managers." I said, "What kind of business is it?" And he described the business. And it was employing thousands of people. Most of them not in South Africa, by the way, but in places where the wages are even lower. And afterwards I asked myself, is this what you struggled for? Is this what you went to prison all these years for? Is this what Joe Slovo and the heroes of MK and all the martyrs were for? Sharpeville and Soweto, and is this what it was for? So that guys like you, who were revolutionaries, could now be the business partner of princes and be as rich as Croesus? Perhaps that's a subject, Esther, you and I can return to. I'd be very interested in doing so. But before I let you go, I just need to explore something else with you. Most people in Britain think that Africa is a basket case, that Africa is a poor place, that Africans are people to whom you must give alms. You must put a red nose on, you must dress up and do silly things to raise. But you and I both know that Africa is an extremely rich place, and that if only the bloodsuckers hadn't sucked its blood during the colonial period, we could already see that. But give us your overview at the eve of 2014 of the future for Africa in the next decade.
The future, there's two possible futures for Africa. If we continue going down the road that we go down, where we're not standing on our own laurels, where we are not taking seriously the responsibilities of freedom then the future is quite dire. Because what we're going to see is an increase in military interventions. We are going to see increasing resource wars as a result of trying to extract more and more resources from the continent, which help to feed Europe and North America and so forth, and many other parts of the world. And we're going to see increasing dispossession of the masses, the most impoverished. We're going to see increasing climate chaos. That's one possible future for Africa. If we maintain the leaders that we have, who lack the courage, who lack the independence of mind to truly work in the best interests of their people. But there's another future for Africa, and that's the one that I'm most hopeful of. And it is the future of the masses, the people on the ground who are resisting every day, who don't want charity, who recognize that more is taken out of Africa than is ever put in, who recognize that they have a right not to necessarily ownership, but to benefit from the resources that comes out of the land. So we're talking about oil, we're talking about all of the mineral resources, and they want to share that equitably. And so they themselves are engaged in struggles against neo-colonialism in Africa. And so that wider context for me is the context of reparations. And many people just think reparations is about financial conversation because we don't control the media and the media likes to promote that narrative. It's just about giving us a bag of cash. And then, you know, that sort of engenders a response, well, we're not giving them any more cash because what are they doing with all the cash they've had? And quite clearly, they're not showing that they're able to utilize the cash. Ultimately, reparations, it has the potential to fundamentally restructure the global institutions of power, to restructure the way in which we relate as a continent geopolitically, to restructure and transform our societies, because it's about repairing the harm. And so what I see happening is an increase in reparations consciousness, not just amongst Africans, but across all oppressed peoples on the planet who are struggling around similar reparation struggles, whether it's about land reform, whether it's about opposing neo-colonialism and colonialism, whether it's about transforming the borders that separate us and fuel internecine and inter-ethnic conflict, or what have you. So that, for me, is the future.
Esther, I don't know why you're not on the television and radio every night. A last point. There's a new scramble for Africa, and you referred to it obliquely in terms of military intervention. This day, France re-entered the Central African Republic. It has forces already in Mali. It has forces already in Côte d'Ivoire, and God knows where else. The British are as thick as thieves with Rwanda, and one or two other places are the site of the African Command of the United States Armed Forces, which is a new development whereby the United States insists on putting its boot print on the continent physically for the first time, unlike the European colonizers who sucked the blood of the Africans and even carried them off in the holds of ships as slaves. Is this going to continue? For how long will the Africans tolerate foreign armies arriving?
Oh, that's a very good question, a very reflective question. How long are we going to tolerate these people? You know, I don't feel this will be tolerated much longer, because one of the things that we don't hear a lot about is the resistance on the ground. And there are pockets of it. So, for instance, in the Niger Delta, amongst the Ogoni peoples, there have been resistance to the extractive industries and the multinational corporations. So that consciousness is growing across the continent. And there are more and more people who, for the very basic notion of their own survival, can no longer stand back and be waiting for the crumbs, basically, at a table that they have helped to produce, whilst others, in particular foreign governments, European governments, the United States governments, imperialist governments, continue to facilitate with fifth columnists who are working and so-called leaders in their own countries, the continued dispossession of their peoples. However, it doesn't look good because AFRICOM is there kind of already on the ground in many parts. And it's not just France and it's not just Britain. It's also being facilitated by NATO and so forth. And in fact, one of the ongoing reparations demands, if you like, in campaigns that got aborted with the killing of Chief Abiola in Nigeria was looking at reform of the United Nations and the Security Council. Because what we see now are these so-called global institutions facilitating the continued pillage of the continent and using so-called law, but really unjust law, to, justify these interventions.
Esther Stanford Xosei, I wish I could talk to you for much longer. I always say that, but I don't always mean it. In this case, I definitely do. Thanks very much for joining us on the Mother of All Christmas podcasts.
Fighting the golden flakes of change with the milk of human kindness. This